Howdy stranger. Tonight, we're gonna dive into a world where a single flame could stop a 75-ton locomotive in its tracks. A time when the rumble of iron wheels on freshly laid track was the heartbeat of America's westward expansion. The Old West, that dusty, dangerous slice of American history that you've seen in movies, but let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive a week in. Not with your smartphone addiction and complete lack of horseback riding skills. Then, before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I do here. Where are you listening from tonight? Drop your location and local time in the comments below. I always get a kick out of knowing this story is playing in Tokyo at breakfast and Tucson at bedtime. Relax, turn off your notifications, slow down your thoughts, and imagine that the only light around comes from a campfire. That's where tonight's story begins. As you listen with your eyes closed and let the Old West keep you company until sleep arrives. You're standing beside a railroad track as the sun sets behind distant mountains. The air smells of sage and wood smoke, and somewhere a coyote is tuning up for the night's concert. In your hand is a simple oil lantern, its flame dancing behind glass. This modest object might seem insignificant compared to the behemoth of steel and steam approaching in the distance. But to everyone in the 1880s, this lantern is power incarnate. The approaching train weighs close to 150,000 pounds and barrels forward with the momentum of a small meteorite. Yet, when you step forward and swing your lantern in a horizontal arc, side to side, the engineer will bring that massive machine to a complete stop. This wasn't just courtesy, it was the law of the rails. What seems like magic to modern eyes was actually a sophisticated communication system developed out of necessity. Before radios, before telephones, before any electrical communication could span the vast distances of the American frontier, railroads needed a universal language. They found it in light. A horizontal swing meant stop. A vertical up and down motion signaled proceed. A circular motion warned back up. And in the dark expanses of the Western Territories, these signals could be seen from distances that would astonish you, especially considering that the average smartphone dies after just 8 hours without a charging station. But here's something most history books don't tell you. Lantern signals were so respected that even notorious outlaws like Jesse James and Butch Cassidy would use them legitimately before committing their robberies. They knew that ignoring proper signaling protocols could result in a catastrophic crash, and even train robbers had professional standards to maintain. Speaking of those outlaws, historians still debate whether the famous train robbers were motivated more by profit or notoriety. Some scholars maintain that newspaper coverage was often their primary goal, with the actual loot serving as a secondary benefit. The more dramatic the heist, the bigger the legend, the 19th century equivalent of going viral. While the railroads publicly claimed these lantern signals were foolproof, internal company documents reveal a fascinating truth. Roughly 1 in every 20 emergency stops was actually caused by fireflies or reflections from water puddles that engineers mistook for stop signals. Railroad companies kept these embarrassing incidents quiet. Of course, can't have the public thinking the mighty railroads could be stopped by a bug. You watch as the massive locomotive actually begins slowing in response to your signal. Steel wheels throwing sparks as the brakes engage. The engineer leans out his window, his face illuminated by the glow of the firebox. He's expecting to find a washed-out bridge or obstruction on the track. Instead, he'll find only you, which historically would have resulted in some colorful frontier language being directed your way. The power to stop a train came with serious responsibility. False signals could result in fines or even jail time. And yes, before you ask, train engineers did occasionally stop for pretty women using lanterns, especially in remote areas where social opportunities were limited. This practice became so common that the Southern Pacific Railroad actually included a section in their 1887 Employee Handbook specifically prohibiting stopping for romantic interludes initiated by lantern signal. I guess you could call that the original sliding into DMS. What made these lantern signals so effective wasn't just their visibility but their simplicity. In a frontier filled with people speaking dozens of different languages, light cutting through darkness was universal. Chinese laborers who built the railroads, Irish immigrants who operated them, and native inhabitants whose lands they crossed, all understood these basic signals. You step back from the track as the train grinds to a halt, its massive drive wheels finally going still. In today's world, it would take a sophisticated electronic signal system, backup procedures, and probably 3 apps to accomplish what you just did with a $2 lantern and a steady arm. There's something beautifully elegant about that, isn't there? In a world of complicated technology, sometimes the simplest solutions are the most reliable. The train sits idle now, steam hissing from its valves like a giant breathing beast. The engineer will be climbing down soon, lantern in hand, to find out why he was stopped. Perhaps tonight, you'll let the train continue on its way with a vertical swing of your light. Or perhaps you'll claim there was something on the track that you cleared away. A common excuse used by frontier folks who sometimes just wanted to receive mail or news from distant towns when regular stops weren't scheduled. As the train pulls away, accelerating back into the darkness with a rhythmic chuffing of its steam engine, you decide to make camp for the night. The vast prairie stretches around you, a sea of grass under an ocean of stars. It's time to talk about one of the most peculiar aspects of frontier life, how cowboys actually slept on the open range. You gather some dry scrub for a fire, arranging the kindling in a small pit. As the flames take hold, you consider the bedroll you'll soon unfurl. Most modern campers give little thought to the orientation of their sleeping bags, but for cowboys of the 1870s and 80s, the direction you pointed your head was serious business. Cowboys almost universally slept with their heads pointing north and their feet toward the fire, which was typically built on the south side of the camp. This wasn't just random preference or superstition, though the West had plenty of both. This practice had several practical purposes that meant the difference between a good night's rest and absolute misery. First, sleeping with your head north allegedly aligned your body with Earth's magnetic field. Many cowboys swore this improved sleep quality and reduced morning headaches. While modern science might scoff at this particular reasoning, neurologists have recently discovered that some mammals do indeed have magnetoreceptive cells that respond to Earth's magnetic field. So maybe those dusty cowboys were onto something after all. The more pragmatic reason, however, was meteorological. In the American West, prevailing weather patterns typically move from southwest to northeast. By positioning yourself with feet to the south, toward the fire, and head to the north, any sudden rain would hit your boots first, giving you precious extra seconds to pull your oilskin slicker over your head before your face got soaked. Clever, right? And you thought cowboys were just rough-and-tumble types, without sophisticated survival strategies. Here's a quirky detail most Hollywood westerns miss completely. Cowboys typically removed their pants before sleeping but kept their shirts on. In a rare 1895 diary entry, one cattle driver explained, "Shirts collect less dirt than trousers and are quicker to dry. A man can ride a week in the same shirt, but pants worn day and night will rub a man raw at the knees and elsewhere." That elsewhere is doing some heavy lifting in that sentence, wouldn't you say? You arrange your bedroll now, following this time-tested wisdom. The fire crackles companionably as you stretch out, looking up at the staggering display of stars. Without light pollution, the night sky in the 1880s West contained about 4 times as many visible stars as most Americans see today. Some trail diaries describe the Milky Way as so bright it could cast shadows on moonless nights. Another sleep-related curiosity: cowboys developed an elaborate system for night watch rotations. The standard cattle drive employed a technique called night hawking, where men took 2-hour shifts guarding the herd. The most dangerous shifts, midnight to 2 and 2 to 4, were called dog watches and were typically assigned to the youngest riders. Not because the veterans were lazy, but because research, though they wouldn't have called it that, showed younger men recovered more quickly from interrupted sleep. Historians still debate whether this systematic sleep deprivation contributed to the high accident rates on cattle drives. Some scholars argue that the constant rotation of sleep schedules led to a perpetually exhausted workforce, while others contend that the system actually optimized the limited human resources available. Either way, if you struggled after losing an hour of sleep to daylight saving time changes, imagine recalibrating your entire sleep schedule every single night for months on end. While we're on the subject of sleep, let me tell you about the bedroll hierarchy that existed among cowboys. Your bedroll wasn't just for sleeping, it was a status symbol. New ranch hands often had simple blankets, while veterans sported elaborate setups with canvas tarps, multiple wool blankets, and even primitive mattresses stuffed with grass or horsehair. The trail boss might have the ultimate luxury, a bedroll with a waterproof ground sheet made of rubberized canvas, imported at great expense from Eastern manufacturers. You might think sleep would come easily after a 14-hour day in the saddle, but cowboys developed interesting methods to combat insomnia. One popular technique involved mentally tracing the brands of every ranch they'd ever worked for. Another method, documented in several trail memoirs, involved wiggling the toes of each foot in sequence, supposedly drawing blood away from an overactive brain. If these techniques failed, there was always night medicine, usually a splash of whiskey, but occasionally more exotic concoctions. One recipe noted in a trail cook's journal called for warm milk, honey, and a pinch of gunpowder, which, given the saltpeter content of frontier gunpowder, might actually have had mild sedative properties, though I'd recommend sticking with melatonin gummies if you're having trouble sleeping tonight. Speaking of discomfort, here's something your Western movies never show: the unique pillow system cowboys developed. Rather than proper pillows, which were impractical on the trail, most cowboys slept with their heads on their saddles, but not directly on the hard leather seat. That would be miserable. Instead, they'd place their folded jackets over the saddle, creating a surprisingly comfortable headrest that doubled as theft prevention for their most valuable possession. A saddle could cost up to 6 months' wages, making it the frontier equivalent of leaving your MacBook Pro under your pillow. You find yourself growing drowsy now, the fire's warmth reaching your boots, while the cool night air keeps your face refreshingly crisp. This temperature differential, warm feet and cool head, was actually ideal for deep sleep, according to modern sleep science. Those cowboys might not have had memory foam mattresses or Egyptian cotton sheets, but they understood the fundamentals of good rest better than many contemporary insomniacs. As your eyelids grow heavy, you notice one last peculiarity of frontier sleep habits. Complete silence was considered undesirable and even dangerous. Most trail bosses assigned someone to make occasional soft noises, humming, quiet whistling, or gentle guitar strumming. This wasn't entertainment, but security. Complete silence often meant predators were nearby, causing other wildlife to go quiet. The gentle background noise reassured sleepers that all was well. Kind of makes you think differently about that white noise machine on your nightstand, doesn't it? Morning arrives with a crimson splash across the eastern horizon. You rise from your bedroll, joints creaking like old wagon wheels, and your stomach immediately reminds you that it's been far too long since your last meal. This seems like the perfect time to explore one of the most misunderstood aspects of frontier life: what cowboys actually ate on the trail. Forget the classic beans and bacon scene from every Western movie you've ever watched. While these staples certainly made appearances, the actual cowboy diet was surprisingly diverse and, in some ways, more nutritionally balanced than the average American's diet today. Though, admittedly, that's a pretty low bar to clear. You gather some kindling to revive last night's fire embers, thinking about breakfast. If you were a real cowboy in the 1870s, your morning might start with son of a bitch stew. Despite the colorful name, this dish was considered a delicacy on the trail. Made from the heart, liver, kidneys, brain, and marrow, gut of a freshly slaughtered calf, it was the original nose-to-tail dining experience. Long before Brooklyn hipster restaurants made it trendy, the organ meats provided essential nutrients that helped prevent deficiencies during long months on the trail. The cook, or Cookie as he was affectionately known, held nearly dictatorial power in the camp hierarchy, second only to the trail boss. The cook could fire hands, settle disputes, and even administer basic medical care. One journal from an 1882 cattle drive notes, "Our cook doctored 3 men through fever, pulled a rotten tooth, and set a broken arm. We would have followed him to hell carrying buckets of water if he'd asked." Good luck getting that level of dedication from your DoorDash delivery person. The chuck wagon itself was a marvel of frontier engineering, invented by Texas rancher Charles Goodnight in 1866. These mobile kitchens contained dozens of compartments, each meticulously organized to hold flour, beans, dried fruits, coffee, and cooking implements. A chuck wagon could feed up to 20 men 3 meals a day using nothing but a Dutch oven, a coffee pot, and an open fire. The next time your power goes out and you can't figure out how to make dinner, pour one out for these culinary MacGyvers of the prairie. Coffee was the lifeblood of the cattle drive, consumed in quantities that would make your local barista faint. Cowboys drank between 6 and 8 cups daily, almost always black and strong enough to float a horseshoe, as the saying went. The beans were typically roasted fresh in a skillet each morning, then ground with the butt of a pistol or a smooth rock. Next time you complain about your coffee shop getting your oat milk proportion wrong, remember that cowboys literally used gun butts to prepare their morning brew. Now, let's talk about sourdough. Before commercial yeast became widely available, sourdough starter was the primary leavening agent for bread on the frontier. Trail cooks maintained their starters with religious devotion, sometimes keeping the same culture alive for decades. These starters were so valuable that in several documented cases, cooks ran back into burning chuck wagons to save their sourdough jars before rescuing any other possessions. Some historians believe certain sourdough cultures used in San Francisco today can trace their lineage back to these frontier starters. Talk about artisanal. Contrary to popular belief, fresh meat was often available on cattle drives, though not from the valuable steers being transported to market. Instead, cowboys frequently hunted along the trail, adding rabbit, deer, turkey, and even squirrel to the pot. This opportunistic hunting supplemented their provisions and added welcome variety to their diets. One trail boss's ledger from 1878 records, "Shot to sage hens and a jackrabbit. The men ate like kings and complained less for a full day afterward." Food morale management hasn't changed much in 150 years, has it? Historians still debate the prevalence of scurvy among cowboys, with some arguing that seasonal vitamin C deficiencies were common, while others point to the consumption of wild onions, berries, and certain organ meats as providing sufficient nutrients to prevent outright scurvy. What's not disputed is that many cowboys carried dried citrus peel in their saddlebags, chewing it occasionally to sweeten the breath and keep the blood clean. They may not have understood the biochemistry, but they recognized the benefit. You get your fire going properly now, and imagine what breakfast would be like for a working cowboy. If you were lucky, you'd have biscuits and red-eye gravy, a delicacy made by pouring black coffee into the grease left from frying ham. The resulting gravy, with its swirl of coffee and pork fat, contained enough calories to fuel hours of hard riding. Modern nutritionists would have a collective heart attack just looking at it. But when you're burning 5,000 calories a day in the saddle, different rules apply. One of the strangest food preservation methods used on the trail was jerking fresh meat. Unlike today's jerky, which is typically thin-sliced and heavily seasoned, frontier jerky consisted of large strips of meat dipped in salt brine, then hung on the outside of the wagon to air dry as it rolled along. The constant movement created a natural convection that dried the meat surprisingly effectively. By the end of a dusty day's travel, the meat had absorbed so much airborne sediment that cowboys joked they were eating half the territory with every bite. Early Western terroir, if you will. And what about dessert? Cowboys had an almost childlike love of sweets, with molasses and dried fruits being particular favorites. A special treat called bear sign, simple dough, fried in lard and drizzled with molasses, was reserved for celebrations or as rewards for particularly difficult work. This Frontier Donut was so coveted that one Montana outfit used bear sign privileges as a disciplinary system. According to their records, being denied bear sign for a week was more effective at correcting bad behavior than docking pay. The most surprising aspect of cowboy cuisine might be its international influences, with cowboys hailing from Mexico, Germany, former slave states, and even as far away as China in some cases. Chuck wagon menus often featured a multicultural mix of flavors. German cowboys introduced sauerkraut techniques to preserve cabbage on long drives. Mexican vaqueros brought chili peppers and slow cooking methods that transformed tough cuts of meat. This cultural exchange created a unique frontier fusion cuisine long before that concept had a name. As you sip your imaginary morning coffee, watching the sunrise paint the landscape with golden light, you realize that the cowboy approach to food was remarkably pragmatic, yet sophisticated in its own way. They understood something many of us have forgotten in our world of instant gratification and endless variety. Food is fuel, community, comfort, and pleasure, often all at once. Their relationship with what they ate was direct and honest, connected to the land in ways most modern eaters can barely comprehend. The morning sun climbs higher as you finish your imaginary frontier breakfast, and you begin to notice something that Westerns never seem to address. You don't smell great. After days on the trail, even your imagination can conjure the authentic bouquet of unwashed human campfire smoke and horse that would have been your constant companion in the 1880s. Let's talk about one of history's most overlooked subjects, frontier hygiene. You've probably wondered how people managed to stay remotely clean in an environment where water was often more precious than whiskey. The answer involves ingenuity, questionable standards, and some truly creative solutions that would horrify modern dermatologists. First, let's address the elephant-sized misconception in the room, the frontier bath. While movies might show cowboys joyfully plunging into rivers at every opportunity, the reality was starkly different. Most cowboys bathed approximately once every 2 to 3 weeks, and even then, often only partially. A journal entry from a cattle drive in 1875 notes, "Washed my face and neck today. Will try for my feet tomorrow if water holds." That graduated approach to cleanliness makes your pandemic work-from-home hygiene habits seem positively fastidious by comparison. Water scarcity wasn't the only bathing deterrent. There was a widespread belief, not entirely without merit, that removing your protective layer of body oils too frequently left you vulnerable to illness. This natural armor theory was taken so seriously that some outfit bosses actually prohibited excessive bathing during winter months. One rancher's rulebook from 1882 explicitly states, "No man shall bathe more than once weekly from November to March, lest he invite the consumption." That's tuberculosis, not your Amazon shopping habit. You stretch and prepare for the day ahead. Considering what frontier folk did between those infrequent baths, the answer, dry cleaning, and not the kind that involves dropping off your dress shirts. Cowboys would regularly sandbathe, using fine dust to absorb excess oil and odor. They'd find a patch of clean, dry dirt, strip down, and literally roll in it like chinch. The dust would bind to oils, and when they shook it off, theoretically some of the dirt and smell went with it. The next time you're appalled by dry shampoo, remember its significantly dustier ancestor. Hair care presented its own challenges. Without regular access to soap, cowboys developed alternative washing methods using local resources. Yucca root, when crushed and mixed with water, creates a surprisingly effective natural soap, rich in saponins. Another popular option was bear grease, brilliantine, rendered fat mixed with scented herbs that was worked through the hair to control frizz, add shine, and repel insects. Early frontier influencers swore by it. Imagine the sponsored content. This messy mane tamed with just one application of genuine bear fat. Swipe up for your free sample. Dental hygiene on the frontier would give your orthodontist nightmares. The most common tool for cleaning teeth was a chew stick, literally just a twig, frayed at one end by chewing it. Typically made from willow, which contains natural pain-relieving compounds similar to aspirin. These primitive toothbrushes were surprisingly effective at removing food particles, if not at preventing decay. Tooth powder, when available, was made from salt mixed with baking soda or charcoal. For frontier breath freshening, men chewed herbs like parsley, mint, or anise, or resorted to that peculiar cowboy favorite, chewing tobacco. Nothing says minty fresh like a mouthful of tobacco juice. Speaking of tobacco, it served multiple hygiene functions beyond its recreational use. Cowboys often applied moist tobacco to insect bites to reduce itching. The nicotine actually works as a topical analgesic. More disturbingly, tobacco juice was sometimes used as an impromptu hand sanitizer before meals. The antimicrobial properties of tobacco do have some scientific basis, but it's probably best to stick with Purell, rather than hawking a loogie onto your palms before dinner. Laundry presented an even greater challenge than personal hygiene. With limited water and soap, clothing was washed infrequently at best. Many cowboys owned just 2 shirts, the one they were wearing and the one hanging on the saddle to air out. This rotation system, combined with the antibacterial properties of intense sun exposure, was their version of the delicate cycle. One cowhand wrote in his journal, "Turned my shirt today. The back now faces front. Should be good for another week." Innovative problem solving or peak grossness? You decide. Historians still debate the actual smell level of the average frontier town. Some scholars argue that the human nose adapts quickly to prevailing odors, making the stench less noticeable to residents than we might imagine. Others point to contemporary accounts from Eastern visitors who were nearly overcome by the olfactory assault of unwashed bodies, animal manure, and primitive sewage systems. One Boston journalist visiting Dodge City in 1878 wrote, "The air is thick with odors that would make a slaughterhouse seem a perfumery." Perhaps not the tourism slogan they were hoping for. You dust off your clothes and consider one of the frontier's most ingenious hygiene solutions, the bandana. This humble square of cloth served dozens of functions, from sun protection to makeshift filter when drinking questionable water. Its most important use, however, was as a personal air purifier. When riding behind a herd of cattle, essentially a dust and methane generating machine, cowboys would pull their dampened bandanas over their noses, creating a primitive filtration mask. The original N95, if you will, though with considerably less rigorous testing. For the ladies of the frontier, hygiene challenges were compounded by social expectations. While men could get away with visible grime, women were still expected to maintain standards of cleanliness with woefully inadequate resources. Their solution: strategic washing and copious amounts of perfume. A woman's hygiene routine prioritized visible areas, face, neck, and hands, while less exposed body parts might go unwashed for extended periods. As one frontier wife delicately put it in a letter home, "I remain presentable where it matters, and practical where it doesn't." Perhaps the most ingenious frontier hygiene hack was the use of smoke as a cleaning agent. Cowboys would smoke wash their clothes by hanging them near the campfire, allowing the smoke to penetrate the fabric. While this didn't remove dirt, the smoke killed bacteria and masked odors. Some even claimed it deterred parasites, though the scientific jury is still out on that one. Next time you're annoyed about smelling like a campfire after a bonfire night, remember you're participating in a time-honored cleaning tradition. If all this talk of frontier filth has you reaching for your hand sanitizer, consider this surprising fact. Despite their questionable hygiene, many cowboys were actually healthier than their urban counterparts. The combination of constant outdoor living, physical activity, and exposure to a wide variety of environmental bacteria seems to have created surprisingly robust immune systems. An 1885 military doctor's report noted, "The frontier men, despite appearances suggesting otherwise, suffer remarkably little from the infectious diseases plaguing our cities. Turns out there's something to that whole dirt don't hurt philosophy after all." As the day warms up, you check your supplies and notice a peculiar weight on your hip. There, nestled in a warm leather holster, sits a Colt single-action army revolver, the famous Peacemaker. This iconic six-shooter was more than just a tool of violence in the Old West. It was a sophisticated communication device, status symbol, and social equalizer all rolled into one steel package. Let's explore the language of six-shooters that most history books never mention. You draw the revolver, feeling its substantial weight. At about 2.5 pounds fully loaded, it's significantly heavier than most modern handguns. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a statement. In frontier society, how you carried your gun spoke volumes about your position, intentions, and even moral character long before you ever pulled the trigger. For instance, the position of your holster telegraphed specific messages to those who understood the code. A low-slung holster, tied down on the thigh, generally signified someone who used their gun professionally, whether as a lawman or an outlaw. This setup prioritized speed over comfort, a clear signal that the wearer expected to draw in anger. Conversely, a higher-riding holster, positioned for a crossbody draw, suggested someone who carried for practical purposes rather than for showdowns. Most working cowboys preferred this arrangement, as it interfered less with riding and daily chores. Even more telling was whether a man carried his revolver with the hammer resting on an empty chamber. This safety practice, known as 5 beans in the wheel, was nearly universal among experienced gun handlers. Despite what Hollywood depicts, keeping all 6 chambers loaded was considered the mark of either a greenhorn or a fool. As one Arizona sheriff reportedly put it, "The cemetery is full of men who trusted that 6th chamber." The next time someone describes themselves as going in 6 guns blazing, you'll know they're advertising their frontier ignorance. You carefully check your imaginary peacemaker, confirming that the hammer rests on an empty chamber. This subtle detail would have immediately communicated to others that you were prudent and experienced. In a society where first impressions could be a matter of life and death, these silent signals were crucial. The make and model of your firearm conveyed information about your economic status. A factory-engraved Colt with pearl grips might cost 6 months' wages for an average cowboy, the frontier equivalent of flashing a Rolex. Practical men often viewed such ornate weapons with suspicion. Wyatt Earp allegedly advised, "Fast is fine, but accuracy is final. The fancy gun won't help you if you can't hit what you're aiming at." The original all-hat, no cattle critique, but for firearms. Historians still debate whether the practice of notching gun handles to count kills was common or largely a Pulp Fiction invention. Some scholars argue it was primarily a cinematic device, while others point to several authenticated weapons with such markings. What's not disputed is that openly displaying a notched gun would have made you a pariah in most frontier communities. Contrary to popular belief, the Old West generally frowned on violence as a first resort. A notched gun basically advertised, "I make bad decisions," not the message most wanted to send. One aspect of gun culture rarely depicted in westerns was the frequent mismatch between ammunition and firearms. With dozens of calibers and proprietary cartridges in circulation, cowboys often carried guns, chambered for whatever ammunition they could reliably obtain, rather than what the gun was designed for. This pragmatic approach sometimes led to decreased accuracy and reliability, but having a functioning firearm with available ammunition was preferred over an ideal weapon you couldn't feed. It's the frontier equivalent of using an Android charger for your iPhone. Not perfect, but it'll do in a pinch. The sound of gunfire itself was a communication system across the vast spaces of the frontier. 3 shots fired in rapid succession universally signaled an emergency requiring assistance. 2 shots spaced evenly often meant all clear or return to camp. These acoustic signals could travel for miles across open country, creating an early warning network in regions without telegraphs or other communication infrastructure. Next time you hear a car alarm with its coded series of honks and wails, tip your hat to this frontier predecessor. You holster your peacemaker, noting how the simple action of how you replace your gun speaks volumes. Returning a weapon to leather slowly and deliberately communicated peaceful intentions, while a quick shove suggested continued alertness or hostility. These subtle body language cues developed into an elaborate kinetic vocabulary understood by those who lived and died by the gun. Modern law enforcement still teaches versions of these same physical communications, the tactical legacy of frontier gun handlers. Perhaps most fascinating was the social language embedded in when you chose to remove your gun belt entirely. Entering a home with your six-shooter still strapped on was a serious breach of etiquette, roughly equivalent to wearing shoes on someone's bed or taking a phone call during a funeral today. However, in certain establishments, like saloons, removing your gun could signal vulnerability or naivety. This created complex social dances, where men might disarm partially, removing the gun but leaving it visible on the bar to signal peaceful intentions while maintaining status. While guns were ubiquitous on the frontier, shooting skills varied dramatically. Despite the mythology of the naturally talented gunslinger, most famous shootists practiced obsessively. Wyatt Earp reportedly fired hundreds of rounds weekly to maintain his proficiency. Doc Holliday, despite his reputation as a gunfighter, was actually much more skilled with a knife and considered the gun a backup weapon. The disconnect between Hollywood's portrayal of instant expertise and the reality of hard-earned skill continues to shape American perceptions of firearms mastery. You begin walking toward a nearby town, visible in the distance, considering another aspect of frontier firearms, their role as tools beyond violence. Six-shooters were used to signal stage departures, start horse races, summon ferry operators, and even to create makeshift alarm clocks. One rancher's diary mentions placing his revolver hammer on a pan balanced on a stick. When the stick burned through, the gun would fall and wake the dead with its clatter. The original snooze alarm, with considerably higher stakes if you rolled over the wrong way. As the town grows closer, you consider one final aspect of six-shooter communication: gun twirling and manipulation. Far from being mere showmanship, elaborate handling demonstrated dexterity and familiarity with one's weapon without the threat of actual violence. A skilled spinner could intimidate potential threats without firing a shot. However, practical gun handlers viewed excessive flourishes with the same disdain modern special forces operators reserve for mall ninjas. As Bat Masterson supposedly quipped, the fancy twirler usually does his spinning in the graveyard. The more things change, the more they stay the same. As you approach the frontier town, you notice a stagecoach pulling up outside a weathered clapboard building with a hand-painted sign, Matrimonial and Correspondence Society. The door swings open, and a woman steps out, squinting in the harsh sunlight as she clutches a letter. She's just arrived on the frontier, one of thousands who participated in one of the Old West's most misunderstood institutions, the Mail-Order Bride Network. You pause to watch this scene unfold, aware that you're witnessing a pivotal moment in someone's life story. The mythology of mail-order brides has been distorted by everything from dime novels to modern reality TV, but the truth was far more nuanced and, frankly, more interesting than the simplified narratives that survive today. Contrary to popular belief, mail-order marriages weren't primarily about desperate men acquiring subservient wives. The frontier gender imbalance was dramatic in some mining towns. Men outnumbered women by 50 to 1, but these correspondence courtships were often initiated and controlled by the women themselves. Think of them less as mail-order brides and more as the original online dating pioneers, just with significantly longer response times and no profile pictures. One Montana newspaper from 1876 carried an advertisement from a young lady of good family, educated, refined, and of prepossessing appearance, seeking correspondence with gentlemen of means and character with matrimonial intentions. She included her requirements: must own property, abstain from tobacco and spirits, and provide references from a minister and banker. Hardly sounds like someone desperate to escape her circumstances, does it? This was Tinder with background checks and character references, 140 years before swiping right. You move closer to the Matrimonial Society building, noticing the woman is now engaged in what appears to be a tense conversation with a man, presumably her correspondent. Their body language tells a story of mutual assessment, hopes meeting reality in that awkward first meeting dance that transcends time periods. These initial meetings were often supervised by local matchmaking societies that sprang up specifically to protect women from misrepresentation or worse. These matrimonial societies maintained detailed records, some of which survive today. They reveal surprising statistics that historians still debate. Some scholars argue that the success rate of these arranged marriages, measured by longevity and reported satisfaction, actually exceeded conventional courtships of the era. Others point to harrowing accounts of deception and disappointment. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between. What's certain is that these unions shaped the demographic and social landscape of the developing West in ways we're still untangling. What's particularly fascinating is how sophisticated this system became. By the 1880s, specialized matrimonial newspapers circulated throughout America and Europe, filled exclusively with personal advertisements. The Heart and Hand was among the most reputable, featuring hundreds of listings categorized by region, age, and circumstances. These publications sometimes included coded language for everything from physical attributes to fertility, creating a lexicon understood by regular readers. Fully figured and of hearty constitution indicated a larger woman, while modest means but clever hands suggested someone skilled in household economics. The original profile optimization. While we're puncturing myths, let's address another one. The idea that mail-order brides were exclusively young, desperate Eastern women or European immigrants. In reality, the demographic was surprisingly diverse. Widows constituted a significant percentage of marriage seekers, often women with children and property looking for partners rather than providers. An 1879 listing from a widow of 39 years, owning a successful millinery business and 2 well-mannered children, sought a gentleman partner in life and enterprise, with carpentry or mercantile experience preferred. This wasn't desperation, it was strategic life planning. The woman outside the matrimonial society building now produces papers from her handbag, likely the letters that brought her west. These correspondence courtships typically lasted months or even years before culminating in travel arrangements. The letters themselves followed elaborate conventions, gradually progressing from formal introductions to discussions of practical matters, and eventually to personal feelings. One preserved collection shows a couple exchanging 48 letters over 2 years before meeting face to face. That's commitment to the getting to know you phase that makes modern 3-date relationships seem positively hasty. You notice something else about this scene: the quality of the woman's clothing. While not extravagant, her traveling outfit is well made and current with Eastern fashions. This reflects another reality of frontier matchmaking. It wasn't cheap. Women typically invested significant resources in the process, from subscription fees to correspondence societies to the considerable expense of transcontinental travel. One woman's itemized expenses from 1883 show she spent the equivalent of about $9,000 in today's money to secure and reach her frontier match. These were investments, not acts of desperation. Equally misunderstood were the husband hunters, organized groups of women who traveled west together, specifically seeking matrimonial opportunities. Far from being desperate spinsters, many were educated professionals, teachers, nurses, and clerical workers who recognized the economic advantages of the frontier's gender imbalance. An 1874 group from Massachusetts included 3 teachers, a nurse, a bookkeeper, and a dressmaker, all described in newspaper accounts as accomplished ladies of fine character seeking suitable establishment in life. These women leveraged their scarcity value with remarkable savvy, often securing marriage contracts that guaranteed property rights and financial independence that would have been unlikely back east. Historians still debate the impact of these matrimonial migrations on frontier gender dynamics. Some argue that women's scarcity value created more egalitarian marriages than those in established Eastern society. Contemporary accounts note that frontier husbands often performed household tasks that would have been unthinkable for men back east, simply because female labor was too valuable to waste on chores men could do. Others contend that isolation and limited options sometimes trapped women in difficult situations with few avenues of escape. Both perspectives contain elements of truth, reflecting the complex reality of frontier gender relations. The most successful mail-order matches tended to share a crucial quality: thoroughgoing pragmatism. These were partnerships formed with clear-eyed assessment of practical compatibility rather than romantic notions. One remarkably candid 1885 advertisement sought a woman of sturdy health and good humor, skilled in household economy and not averse to rural life. Beauty is welcome but unnecessary. Competence is essential. The woman's response was equally practical. I offer capable management, cheerful disposition, and a determination to succeed in partnership. I neither expect nor offer poetry, but rather steadfast cooperation. They remained married for 41 years. What rarely appears in fictional accounts of mail-order marriages is the community involvement in their success. Frontier towns had a vested interest in attracting and retaining women who were seen as civilizing influences. Newly arrived brides often found themselves welcomed with community gatherings, gifts of household necessities, and networks of support. One Wyoming mining town recorded collecting funds to build a proper house for an incoming bride, complete with the luxury of glass windows to ensure her comfort and persuade her to remain among us. Self-interest, perhaps, but effective community building nonetheless. As you continue toward the heart of town, you see the newly arrived woman and her correspondent walking together toward a restaurant, their initial tension seemingly eased. Whether their match will succeed remains to be seen, but they're participating in a system far more nuanced than modern stereotypes suggest, one that balanced pragmatism with hope, commercial interests with personal desires, and individual choices with community needs. In many ways, these practical pioneers of partnership were creating relationship templates that would have felt strangely familiar to anyone navigating today's world of algorithm-assisted matchmaking. The town comes fully into view now. A single main street lined with false-fronted buildings, most still bearing the sawdust patina of recent construction. Your attention is drawn to the most imposing structure in town. A two-story building with ornate windows and a freshly painted sign proclaiming the Nugget Saloon. As you approach, the swinging doors Part 2 reveal a surprisingly elegant interior that defies the dusty frontier surrounding it. Welcome to the economic epicenter of the Old West, the saloon. While Hollywood has fixed the image of saloons as merely backdrops for gunfights, these establishments were actually the frontier equivalent of today's tech startups, innovative, disruptive business ventures that shaped the economic and social landscape in ways that extended far beyond their physical footprints. Let's push through those iconic batwing doors and explore the complex economics that made saloons the true Silicon Valley of their era. You step inside the Nugget, noting the polished mahogany bar, brass footrail, and large mirror behind the shelves of bottles. All standard features that weren't just decorative but served specific business purposes. That mirror, for instance, allowed patrons to keep an eye on the room behind them, crucial in a society where arguments could escalate quickly, while simultaneously making the space appear larger and more sophisticated. It's the 1880s version of strategic office design, complete with safety features. The first thing that might surprise you about frontier saloons is their sheer profitability. A well-run establishment could recoup its entire startup investment in as little as 3 months. One documented Colorado saloon showed a 480% annual return on investment, numbers that would make modern venture capitalists weep with joy. This extraordinary profitability came from their diversified revenue streams. While modern bars rely primarily on alcohol sales, frontier saloons operated more like platform businesses, monetizing multiple aspects of social interaction. The bartender nods as you approach, wiping down the already gleaming bar top. He's wearing a clean white apron and sporting what appears to be a diamond stickpin in his tie, not unusual for his profession. Frontier bartenders often earned more than bank managers or town officials, with top mixologists commanding salaries equivalent to about $80,000, $100,000 in today's money. The position required a rare combination of skills: expert knowledge of spirits, basic accounting proficiency, diplomatic people management, and often enough physical prowess to maintain order. The modern equivalent might be combining a master sommelier, accountant, therapist, and bouncer into one well-dressed package. You order a whiskey and notice something odd about the bottle. The bartender reaches for its labeled Old Kentucky Bourbon, but bears no tax stamp or recognizable brand. This wasn't unusual. Historians estimate that up to 80% of frontier spirits were either significantly adulterated or completely counterfeit. The authentic article was prohibitively expensive after factoring in transportation costs, so saloon keepers became adept amateur chemists, creating whiskey from raw alcohol, tobacco juice for color, pepper for bite, and various flavorings to mimic aged spirits. One preserved recipe called for burnt sugar, strychnine, and rat poison in careful measure to create the desired flavor profile. The next time you complain about a bartender skimping on your pour, be thankful they're not actively trying to poison you. As the bartender slides your drink forward, don't worry. Our imaginary whiskey is the genuine article. You notice the pricing board. A standard whiskey costs 25 cents, equivalent to about $7 today, while beer is 10 cents and champagne a whopping $3 per bottle. These standardized prices represented one of the saloon's key innovations: transparent, fixed pricing in an era when most goods were subject to haggling or relationship-based pricing. Economists still debate whether saloons popularized this model on the frontier, with some scholars arguing they served as catalysts for the transition to modern retail pricing throughout Western territories. Looking around the Nugget, you notice various games in progress: poker at one table, faro at another, and what appears to be a roulette wheel in the corner. Gambling wasn't just a sideline for saloons, it was often their primary revenue source. A successful gambling operation could generate 5 times the profit of liquor sales, with the house typically taking a 5 to 10% commission on each pot rather than playing against customers. This platform fee model more closely resembles modern companies like Airbnb or Uber than traditional gambling establishments that play against customers. The house literally just provided the platform and took a cut of transactions, disrupting traditional business models. Before disruption was cool, historians still debate the fairness of frontier gambling. Some scholarly work suggests that cheating was less common than portrayed in fiction, as repeated cheating would quickly drive away customers in small communities. Other research indicates that sophisticated cheating methods, from marked cards to mechanical sleeves, were widespread but applied selectively to strangers and drunks rather than locals. Either way, the gambling operations followed a remarkably modern business principle. Customer lifetime value was prioritized over short-term gains. A piano plays softly in the corner, another business innovation rather than mere entertainment. Music attracted customers and encouraged them to stay longer, increasing their total spend. The Nugget, like many upscale saloons, has employed a professional pianist rather than using the player piano found in less prosperous establishments. This live music represented a significant investment, with skilled musicians earning up to $25 weekly, $700 in modern terms, but the return on investment was substantial. Records from one Montana saloon showed music increased average customer dwell time by 36% and total revenue by 28%. Those metrics would impress any contemporary business analyst. What you don't immediately see, but would have been essential to the saloon's business model, is the network of affiliated services. Many saloons operated as hubs for employment networks, mail delivery, banking services, and even medical assistance. A patron could cash a paycheck, send money to family back east, hire workers for a project, and treat a toothache without ever leaving the premises. This super app approach to business, offering multiple high-demand services in one location, mirrors the strategy of modern tech giants trying to keep users within their ecosystem. As you sip your whiskey carefully, you notice the varied clientele. Contrary to Hollywood depictions, frontier saloons were remarkably integrated spaces where cowboys, businessmen, laborers, and professionals mingled freely. This social mixing wasn't just incidental, it was good business. By creating spaces where different economic classes interacted, saloons facilitated deals, partnerships, and information exchange that benefited the entire community. One 1882 mining venture was documented as being funded entirely through connections made at a Denver saloon, turning a bartender's introduction into a business that eventually employed over 200 people. One of the most profitable but least discussed aspects of saloon economics was their role in primitive banking. With formal banking institutions scarce, saloon keepers often stored valuables, extended credit, changed currency, and even made short-term loans. These financial services typically generated 15 to 20% of a successful saloon's revenue while requiring minimal additional investment. The interest rates on these informal loans would make modern payday lenders blush, often 10% weekly. But in a cash-scarce economy, this liquidity service was essential to frontier commerce. The Frontier Saloon's business model contained one final innovation that particularly forward-thinking establishments leveraged: data collection and analysis. The best saloon keepers kept detailed records of customer preferences, credit reliability, and spending patterns. One preserved ledger from a Helena, Montana saloon included notes like J. Smith pays prompt, prefers Maryland rye, generous when winning at cards, and H. Davis unreliable after third drink, good for credit only against next month's mining shares. This customer intelligence system allowed for personalized service, strategic extension of house credit, and early identification of profitable patrons who warranted special attention. Primitive CRM before computers existed. As you finish your drink and prepare to continue your exploration of the town, you realize that beneath their rough exterior and romanticized image, Frontier saloons represented sophisticated business ecosystems that would be recognizable to any modern entrepreneur. They identified market needs, diversified revenue streams, created platform business models, prioritized customer lifetime value, and leveraged network effects, all while serving whiskey of questionable origin and maintaining the occasional spittoon. The next time you see a Wild West shootout in a saloon, remember you're watching a business disruption in progress, not just a backdrop for entertainment. As you leave the saloon, the distant whistle of an approaching train catches your attention. The sound triggers murmurs among the townsfolk, who exchange knowing glances before casually drifting toward side streets and alleyways. Something about this particular arrival has them on edge, and you soon discover why rumors suggest the train might be carrying a significant payroll shipment. The perfect target for a holdup. This seems like an opportune moment to explore one of the most mythologized aspects of frontier life: train robberies. You find a spot on the station platform with a good view of the approaching locomotive, its black smoke visible long before the train itself comes into view. Train robberies occupy an outsized place in Western mythology, romanticized in everything from dime novels to modern films. But the reality of these heists was far more complex, strategic, and often less successful than popular culture suggests. The first surprising fact about train robberies: they were relatively rare. Between 1866 and 1899, historians have documented approximately 130 train robberies across the entire American West. That's about 4 per year across millions of square miles. Hardly the epidemic portrayed in fiction. Your chances of experiencing a train robbery as a passenger were roughly equivalent to winning a minor lottery prize today. This statistical rarity didn't prevent railroad companies from using the threat to sell sensationalized guidebooks warning travelers of the ever-present danger of bandits, while conveniently glossing over the much greater risk of accidents and derailments. The train pulls into the station now, hissing steam and squealing brakes as it comes to a stop. You notice something that rarely appears in fictional depictions: an express car positioned directly behind the locomotive, separated from passenger cars by a coal tender. This wasn't random positioning. By the 1880s, railroad companies had developed sophisticated anti-robbery measures, including strategic train composition. The express car's position made it difficult to access without first dealing with the engineer and fireman, who were often armed themselves. Historians still debate the effectiveness of various anti-robbery measures employed by railroad companies. Some scholars argue that dedicated express guards, known as shotgun messengers, significantly reduced successful robberies, while others maintain that the most effective deterrent was simply the low value of most shipments relative to the risk involved. What's not disputed is that railroad companies spent more money advertising their security measures than implementing them. A frontier version of security theater that would make today's airport TSA procedures seem modest by comparison. As passengers disembark, you observe another security feature that movies typically omit. The express car has no exterior handles or latches, just a small reinforced window for communication. By the 1880s, most express cars were essentially rolling vaults, with steel plating, specialized locks, and often false compartments to hide particularly valuable shipments. One preserved Southern Pacific Railroad memo instructed agents to place decoy safe in visible position while securing actual valuables behind false wall panel. This early version of security misdirection proved remarkably effective against all but the most sophisticated robbers. Speaking of robbers, the demographics of train bandits defies Hollywood stereotypes. The typical train robber wasn't a career criminal, but rather a displaced worker, often a former railroad employee, discharged soldier, or struggling miner with inside knowledge of railroad operations. Case records show that nearly 40% of apprehended train robbers had previously worked for railroad companies, suggesting these crimes were often acts of economic desperation or revenge rather than chosen criminal careers. The iconic career outlaw, represented by Jesse James or Butch Cassidy, was the exception rather than the rule. The most successful train robbers understood that timing and location were everything. Unlike the dramatic moving train robberies popularized in films, approximately 80% of actual robberies occurred while trains were stopped or moving very slowly through remote areas. Robbers typically selected locations based on grade trains move slowest going uphill, distance from telegraph stations to delay alerts, and proximity to escape routes, usually rugged terrain unsuitable for pursuit. This strategic planning more closely resembled a military operation than the chaotic heists depicted in entertainment. You watch as railroad employees unload various crates and mailbags from the express car, noting the casual efficiency with which they handle what might be significant valuables. This points to another historical reality. The high-value payroll shipments so often featured in Western fiction were actually rare. Most trains primarily carried mail, commercial goods, and moderate-value bank transfers. The average take from a successful train robbery was approximately $3,000 to $5,000, roughly $100,000 today. Substantial but hardly the millions suggested in popular narratives. One detailed study of robberies between 1870 and 1885 found that nearly a third of attempts netted less than $500, barely justifying the risk involved. What made train robberies particularly appealing despite these modest returns was their psychological impact. Robbing a symbol of industrial progress and Eastern capital represented a powerful statement in the rapidly changing West. Contemporary newspaper accounts often portrayed train robbers as modern-day Robin Hoods, challenging corporate interests, even when the actual robbers were simply opportunistic criminals. An 1884 editorial in a Colorado newspaper described train robbers as rough men enacting rough justice against the railroad, barons who themselves rob through monopoly and rate fixing. This romantic perception helped some bandits achieve folk hero status, despite their relatively mundane criminal activities. The strategic choreography of a well-executed train robbery would have impressed a military tactician. The most successful heists typically involved 5 to 7 men with clearly defined roles: the flagman, who stopped the train, the engineer handlers who secured the locomotive crew, the express specialists who focused on the valuable car, the passenger controllers who kept bystanders in check, and at least one lookout positioned to warn of approaching trouble. This division of labor allowed a competent gang to complete a robbery in under 20 minutes, critical when telegraph alerts could summon posses from nearby settlements. As the train prepares to depart, you notice something else movies typically get wrong. There are no dynamite charges being set. despite countless film depictions of outlaws blowing open safes with explosives. This method was exceptionally rare in actual train robberies. Dynamite was dangerous to transport, difficult to use precisely, and risked destroying the very valuables the robbers sought. Historical records indicate that most express car safes were opened either through intimidation of employees who knew the combination or through more subtle safe-cracking techniques using specialized tools. The dramatic explosion was primarily a Hollywood invention designed for visual impact. The most fascinating aspect of train robbery history might be the elaborate countermeasures developed in response. By the 1890s, some trains carried hidden guards in special compartments built into regular passenger cars, ready to emerge and surprise robbers mid-heist. Others employed early surveillance systems, including modified telescope-style optics that allowed engineers to observe the track far ahead for signs of ambush. The Pinkerton Detective Agency even experimented with disguising agents as ordinary passengers, creating what might be the first undercover security operations in American law enforcement. Historians still debate the actual success rate of train robberies. Some research suggests that as many as 70% of attempted robberies ended with the criminals acquiring at least some valuables, while other studies put the success rate closer to 40%. What's clear is that the consequences of failure were severe. Approximately 30% of identified train robbers were killed, either during the robbery or in subsequent pursuits. Another 40% were eventually captured and imprisoned. The romantic notion of retiring to a life of luxury after a successful heist rarely materialized. Most train robbers who evaded immediate capture continued committing crimes until luck inevitably ran out. As the train departs without incident, no robbery today. It seems you're left contemplating the gap between myth and reality. Train robberies, like much of Western history, have been transformed from complex socio-economic phenomena into simplified entertainment narratives. The real story involves corporate security theater, economic desperation, strategic planning, and the grinding efficiency of industrialization overtaking a formerly wild frontier. Not quite as glamorous as the legends, perhaps, but infinitely more revealing about the true nature of the American West. As the train disappears around a bend, you notice a weathered wagon parked at the edge of town. Its sides are painted with faded but elaborate lettering proclaiming Dr. Thaddeus Blackwell's miraculous elixir of life cures what ails you. A small crowd has already gathered around this frontier pharmaceutical entrepreneur. The arrival of a medicine show presents the perfect opportunity to explore one of the most colorful and misunderstood aspects of Western life: frontier medicine. You approach the gathering just as Dr. Blackwell, almost certainly not a real doctor, launches into his practiced spiel. He's dressed in a black frock coat that has seen better days, sporting an impressive mustache, waxed to dangerous points. Medicine on the frontier existed in a fascinating space between folk tradition, emerging science, desperate innovation, and outright quackery. Let's examine this peculiar healthcare ecosystem that kept people alive or hastened their demise. In the challenging environment of the Old West, the first thing to understand about frontier medicine is that formal healthcare was extraordinarily scarce. In 1885, the entire Arizona Territory had only 36 physicians, serving a population of nearly 70,000 people spread across 114,000 square miles. That's approximately one doctor for every 1,944 people, with some communities having no medical professional within 100 miles. By comparison, today's ratio is about one doctor per 384 Americans. This scarcity created a healthcare vacuum that was filled by an eclectic array of practitioners ranging from well-intentioned amateurs to dangerous charlatans. Dr. Blackwell produces a bottle of amber liquid, holding it up so it catches the sunlight, made from a secret formula discovered in the mountains of Tibet. He proclaims, combining ancient wisdom with modern science. This claim would have been difficult to verify in an era before Google, giving medicine show operators remarkable freedom in their marketing claims. The typical patent medicine contained primarily alcohol, sometimes up to 40% by volume. often mixed with various herbal ingredients and, frequently, alarming additives including opium, cocaine, or even mercury and arsenic. Essentially, frontier patent medicines worked in the sense that they made you too intoxicated or high to care about your symptoms. You examine one of the bottles being sold, priced at an ambitious $1, about $30 in today's money. The formulations of these medicines were tightly guarded secrets, and for good reason. An 1879 analysis of one popular consumption cure revealed it contained primarily alcohol, water, molasses, for flavor, and a small amount of cannabis extract. Total production cost, approximately 3 cents per bottle. The markup would make even today's pharmaceutical executives blush. This was truly the original high-margin, direct-to-consumer healthcare business model. What's most surprising about frontier patent medicines is that some actually worked, albeit rarely for the conditions they claimed to treat. Many contained willow bark, a natural source of salicylic acid, similar to aspirin, coca leaf extracts, an effective local anesthetic, or other botanicals with legitimate medicinal properties. An 1885 field test of 12 popular elixirs found that while none cured the chronic conditions advertised, several provided effective short-term symptom relief through their combination of analgesic, anti-inflammatory, and psychoactive ingredients. One researcher noted, "The patient may still have tuberculosis, but at least briefly feels no pain and has boundless optimism." Sometimes feeling better was enough in an era with few definitive cures. Historians still debate the overall impact of patent medicines on frontier health. Some scholars argue they provided psychological comfort and occasional symptomatic relief in situations where no other care was available, while others emphasize the dangers of unregulated compounds that sometimes contained lethal ingredients. What's not disputed is their cultural significance. Patent medicines represented one of the first nationally marketed consumer products, with advertising techniques that still influence modern marketing. Those vintage ads, promising miraculous restoration of youthful vigor, aren't so different from today's Instagram posts, promoting wellness supplements. Dr. Blackwell now calls for a volunteer from the crowd, selecting a man with a visible limp. This was a common medicine show technique, often employing plants in the audience who would demonstrate miraculous cures after consuming the product. But beyond these theatrical performances, the frontier developed legitimate folk remedies born of necessity and observation. You might be surprised to learn how many were actually effective. For instance, moldy bread was commonly applied to wounds, a practice modern science recognizes as an early form of antibiotic treatment. As some molds produce penicillin-like compounds, willow bark tea was prescribed for pain and fever, effectively delivering the same active ingredient found in aspirin. For snake bites, a poultice of crushed plantain leaves which contains compounds that inhibit venom spread was a standard treatment. These remedies weren't based on scientific understanding but on generations of trial and error that sometimes arrived at genuinely effective treatments. The medicine show continues as Dr. Blackwell dramatically administers his elixir to the volunteer, who, minutes later, demonstrates remarkable improvement in his mobility. The crowd murmurs appreciatively. Beyond the showmanship, frontier communities developed sophisticated healthcare networks based on shared knowledge and specialized skills. Most settlements had at least one person recognized for particular healing abilities: the woman who knew which plants reduced fever, the man who could set broken bones, the elder who delivered babies. These informal practitioners rarely claimed medical authority but provided essential services in doctorless communities. You notice an elderly woman watching the medicine show with obvious skepticism. She likely represents the backbone of actual frontier healthcare, the community healer with practical knowledge passed down through generations. Female healers played a particularly important role, maintaining and transmitting medical knowledge even when formally excluded from professional practice. An 1880 survey of one Wyoming county found that while it had no licensed physicians, 7 women were recognized as skilled healers who jointly attended to most community medical needs. Their expertise combined traditional European practices, Native American botanical knowledge, and practical innovations developed through frontier necessity. Native American medical knowledge significantly influenced frontier healthcare, though this contribution is often overlooked in historical accounts. Many effective plant-based remedies entered mainstream use through observation of indigenous practices. Echinacea for immune support, Yerba Santa for respiratory conditions, and Cascara sagrada for digestive issues were all adopted from Native American medicine. Historians still debate the extent of this knowledge transfer, with some arguing it was primarily appropriation without credit, while others emphasize the genuine cross-cultural exchange that occurred in frontier settings where survival often depended on mutual adaptation. The volunteer now purchases several bottles of the elixir, inspiring others to reach for their purses and wallets. Beyond patent medicines and folk remedies, frontier communities employed surprising preventative measures. Whiskey was considered a universal preventative, consumed prophylactically against everything from cholera to rattlesnake bites. While its medical value was questionable, the practice of drinking water mixed with whiskey actually did help prevent some waterborne illnesses, as the alcohol killed certain pathogens. Similarly, the frontier habit of wearing garlic cloves around the neck during disease outbreaks, while seemingly superstitious, had some merit, as garlic compounds have documented antimicrobial properties. Some frontier medical practices were remarkably advanced for their time. Certain midwives practiced surprisingly sophisticated obstetrics, including manual repositioning of breech babies and the use of ergot derivatives to control postpartum hemorrhage. Some isolated communities developed early vaccination programs, particularly against smallpox, using techniques learned from medical journals that might arrive months or years after publication. An 1876 account from a mining settlement describes a self-taught practitioner successfully performing a vaccination campaign using material from mild cases to inoculate vulnerable individuals. Crude by modern standards, but remarkably effective in isolated conditions. As Dr. Blackwell packs up his remaining inventory, the show appears to have been quite successful. You consider one final aspect of frontier medicine, its relationship with formal healthcare. By the 1880s, medical science was advancing rapidly, but information dissemination remained slow. A technique published in a Philadelphia medical journal might take years to reach practitioners in remote territories. This created a strange patchwork where some frontier doctors practiced cutting-edge medicine learned during the Civil War, while others relied on theories decades out of date. One Montana doctor's diary reveals he performed antiseptic surgery according to NT's latest methods while still believing in bloodletting for certain. Conditions, a peculiar hybrid of progressive and archaic approaches typical of frontier medicine. The medicine show wagon rolls away, leaving behind customers clutching their bottles of questionable elixir and, perhaps, a bit of hope. Frontier medicine, for all its flaws and occasional dangers, represented something profoundly human, the determined effort to maintain health and treat suffering using whatever resources were available, from the snake oil salesman to the community healers, from desperate innovations to time-tested folk remedies. This medical ecosystem kept frontier communities functioning in circumstances where modern Americans would likely dial 911 before their symptoms even fully developed. There's something both humbling and inspiring about that resilience, isn't there? As the medicine show wagon disappears down the dusty street, a commotion erupts from the direction of the sheriff's office. A group of grim-faced men on horseback has arrived, and at the center of their formation rides a single figure with hands bound behind his back. You've just encountered one of the most complex and controversial elements of Western life, frontier justice in action. You follow the crowd gathering around the jailhouse, where the prisoner, a haggard man in his 30s with several days' growth of beard, is being escorted inside. The men accompanying him aren't wearing badges or uniforms, yet they operate with an air of authority that the townsfolk seem to respect. This wasn't unusual in the West, where the line between official law enforcement and community-sanctioned vigilantism was often blurry and situational. Let's explore the fascinating reality of justice on the frontier, where the community frequently became judge, jury, and sometimes executioner. The first misconception to address about frontier justice is the notion that the West was universally lawless. In reality, most settled communities were remarkably orderly, with many towns having lower violent crime rates than eastern cities of the same period. What made Western justice distinctive wasn't the absence of law, but the flexible, community-driven nature of its enforcement. When formal judicial systems couldn't keep pace with population growth or geographic expansion, communities developed alternative methods that mixed official procedures with practical improvisation. You overhear fragments of conversation suggesting the prisoner was caught stealing horses. One of the frontier's most serious crimes, horse theft, wasn't merely property crime. In an environment where a horse often meant the difference between life and death, stealing one was tantamount to condemning someone to potential starvation or exposure. This explains why horse thieves faced harsher penalties than many violent offenders. An 1875 Montana newspaper editorial bluntly stated, "A man might kill another in fair fight and face a jury sympathetically, but the horse thief places himself beyond the pale of human sympathy." Different priorities for different times. The sheriff emerges from the jailhouse, addressing the assembled crowd. He's a weathered man with a star pinned to his vest, rather than wearing a typical badge. Another historical reality often missed in depictions of the West. His jurisdiction is likely enormous, by modern standards. Frontier sheriffs commonly covered entire counties spanning thousands of square miles, often with minimal assistance. An 1882 report from Wyoming Territory noted one sheriff responsible for an area larger than Connecticut, with just 2 deputies. This geographical challenge made community participation in law enforcement not just helpful but essential. Historians still debate the effectiveness of frontier law enforcement systems. Some scholars argue that informal justice was remarkably efficient at maintaining social order despite limited resources, while others emphasize the inconsistent application of justice and vulnerability to community biases. What's clear from contemporary accounts is that frontier communities distinguished between different types of crimes with surprising nuance. Property crimes against individuals like horse theft were treated harshly, while property crimes against corporations, particularly railroads and mining companies, often received tacit community approval. One Colorado judge's diary notes, "The jury acquitted a man of clearly stealing railroad timber, while the same afternoon convicting another for taking a neighbor's shovel." You notice a distinct absence in this frontier justice scene. There are no lawyers present. While attorneys certainly existed in the West, many frontier communities conducted legal proceedings with minimal formal representation. In more remote settlements, traveling circuit judges might visit only quarterly, creating months-long delays for trials. This led to the development of preliminary hearings conducted by non-lawyers, where communities essentially determined if the case merited holding a suspect until a judge arrived. These people's courts operated on practical principles rather than legal technicalities, focusing on community standards of evidence and character assessment. The handling of evidence in frontier justice was particularly fascinating. Without forensic science or extensive documentation, communities relied heavily on reputation and witness testimony. This created a system where your standing in the community often mattered more than specific evidence of a crime. An 1879 account from a Colorado mining camp describes how a well-regarded man accused of theft was released based solely on character witnesses, while a stranger facing identical charges with similar evidence was convicted. This reputation-based approach created obvious inequities but also incorporated community knowledge that formal systems might miss, like recognizing when someone with a solid reputation might be experiencing temporary hardship that led to uncharacteristic behavior. As the crowd outside the jailhouse disperses, some men remain behind, engaged in serious discussion. They may be forming an impromptu jury, another common feature of frontier justice. Unlike modern juries selected for impartiality, frontier juries often deliberately included those most familiar with the case and individuals. A Montana mining camp's records show one 1876 trial where the jury included the victim's neighbor, the accused's former employer, and the only man in camp who had witnessed a similar crime previously. This approach prioritized relevant knowledge over impartiality, operating on the principle that community insiders could best determine appropriate justice. The most controversial aspect of frontier justice was undoubtedly vigilantism, organized citizen groups enforcing extra-legal punishment. Popular culture typically portrays vigilantes as impulsive lynch mobs, but historical records reveal many vigilance committees operated with elaborate structures including constitutions, elected officers, and formal procedures. The San Francisco Committee of Vigilance maintained detailed records including testimony transcripts, evidence logs, and voting records on each case they handled. This wasn't random violence, but parallel community governance, filling perceived gaps in official systems. You observe a small group of townspeople who seem to be organizing some form of oversight for the prisoners' handling. This reflects another reality of frontier justice communities. Often checked potential abuses of power through informal monitoring systems, when formal checks and balances were underdeveloped. Social pressure served as a constraint on authorities. One Wyoming sheriff's letter complained, "The citizens have appointed a committee to inspect the jail daily and report on prisoner treatment. They bring food, count heads, and would measure the cells if I allowed it." This community oversight created accountability that formal systems alone couldn't provide in resource-limited environments. Punishments in frontier justice systems were often remarkably pragmatic rather than purely punitive, with limited capacity for long-term imprisonment. Communities developed creative alternatives focused on restitution and community benefit. Minor offenders might be sentenced to public works projects, building roads, digging wells, or repairing community buildings. An 1883 Colorado town record shows a man convicted of public drunkenness and property damage, sentenced to repair the broken windows, provide 3 cords of firewood for the schoolhouse, and abstain from liquor for 6 months on pain of exile from the community. This approach transformed punishment into community improvement while allowing offenders to remain productive. The most severe frontier punishment, hanging, was certainly employed, but less frequently than Hollywood suggests. Most communities viewed execution as a last resort for the most serious offenses or repeat offenders who had exhausted community patience. What's particularly notable is how many frontier hangings involved formal procedures, including trials, deliberation, and even the opportunity for last words or statements. An account from an 1874 Montana Vigilance Committee describes allowing a convicted murderer to write letters to family, make a public statement, and receive religious counsel before his execution. Even extra-legal justice often incorporated elements of formal process and human dignity. As night falls on the frontier town, the fate of the horse thief remains uncertain. Will he face a formal trial when the circuit judge arrives next month? Will the community convene its own court to render more immediate justice? Or will more extreme elements take matters into their own hands? This uncertainty was itself a defining feature of frontier justice, a system that operated in the space between formal law and community standards, adapting to circumstances and resources in ways that were sometimes admirably practical and other times tragically flawed. What's most remarkable about frontier justice wasn't its violence or lawlessness, both often exaggerated in popular culture, but rather how communities constructed functional justice systems under challenging conditions, through a combination of formal structures, community participation, practical innovation, and shared values. Frontier settlements maintained social order with minimal resources. The resulting system was neither as romantic as Western mythologizers suggest, nor as brutally simplistic as critics claim, but rather a complex, adaptive response to the unique challenges of establishing justice on the edge of civilization. Dawn breaks over the frontier town as you make your way toward the stagecoach office. A weathered Concord coach sits outside, its red paint faded from sun and dust, as the driver methodically checks harnesses and wheels before the day's journey. This unassuming figure represents one of the most overlooked yet influential characters in Western history, the stagecoach driver. These men, known variously as jehus, whips, or simply drivers, were far more than mere transporters. They were the information superhighway of their era, connecting isolated communities in ways that shaped the development of the entire frontier. You watch as the driver, a liveryman in his 50s with hands like gnarled oak, moves with practiced efficiency. He wears no flamboyant costume, just practical clothes weathered by years on the box. Yet, there's an unmistakable authority in his movements. Let's explore the secret life of these roadmasters who knew more about America than perhaps anyone else of their time, including the president himself. The first misconception about stagecoach drivers is that they were primarily responsible for handling the team of horses. While driving skills were certainly essential, the best Jehus were selected more for their judgment, reliability, and character than their ability to handle reins. One Wells Fargo hiring document from 1877 specified, "Prefer a man of moderate habits and substantial judgment over superior horsemanship. The former keeps schedules and delivers intact. The latter merely makes an impression." This prioritization reflected the driver's true value, not as a horse handler but as a trusted agent responsible for passengers, mail, and often substantial valuables. The driver loads several mail bags into the coach's boot, handling them with surprising reverence. This care reflected the almost sacred status of mail delivery in frontier communities. Stagecoach drivers were officially sworn mail carriers, taking a federal oath that made interfering with them a serious federal offense. This elevated status gave drivers unique authority that transcended local jurisdictions. They could requisition assistance, demand accommodations, and even conscript help in emergencies under federal authority. One Colorado territorial document records a driver commandeering horses from a private ranch during a blizzard, citing his federal obligation to deliver the mail as legal justification. What made stagecoach drivers truly exceptional wasn't their driving but their unparalleled knowledge. A typical driver working a regular route knew the names, occupations, family connections, and personal histories of virtually everyone living within miles of their route. They recognized individual horses at a distance, memorized water sources and their seasonal reliability, and tracked subtle landscape changes that might affect travel. One driver's diary from 1879 contains entries noting the Jensen Creek risen 2 inches since Tuesday, Williamson's mare foal chestnut colt with blaze, and new mining camp forming north of Sawyer's Ridge, 12 tents visible. This environmental awareness approached a nearly superhuman level of detail. Historians still debate whether stagecoach drivers should be considered America's first professional intelligence network. Some scholars argue their systematic collection and distribution of information effectively created an informal intelligence service that facilitated Western development. Others emphasize that this information sharing was incidental to their transportation role. What's undisputed is that drivers served as critical information nodes, carrying news, rumors, warnings, and opportunities throughout otherwise isolated territories. An 1880 Army report credited stagecoach drivers with providing more reliable intelligence about Native American movements than the military's own scouts. You notice the driver carries a sawed-off shotgun, casually placing it under the box seat before climbing up. This iconic weapon, which gave rise to the term riding shotgun, was only one element of a driver's security responsibilities. What's less known is that drivers typically carried multiple weapons and employed sophisticated security protocols that varied by cargo value and route risk. One company manual instructed regular mail to be placed in boot, registered mail under the driver's seat, express boxes visible but empty, true valuables in secret compartment beneath floorboards. This layered security approach was remarkably effective. Historians estimate that fewer than 4% of stagecoaches carrying significant valuables were successfully robbed. The most valuable asset stagecoach drivers carried wasn't gold or mail, but their mental map of the territory. In an era before accurate maps, drivers memorized hundreds of miles of trails, including seasonal variations, alternative routes, and emergency detours. One California driver reportedly could describe every creek crossing, rocky outcrop, and dangerous curve along a 380-mile route in such detail that new drivers could navigate it successfully on their first attempt. This geographical knowledge was so valuable that stage companies paid retired drivers to brain dump their route knowledge to replacements, creating a continuous oral tradition of territorial intelligence. Passengers begin to board the coach, now a cross-section of frontier society, from a well-dressed businessman to a young woman traveling alone to a dusty prospector. The social role of stagecoach drivers extended far beyond transportation. They served as cross-cultural intermediaries connecting different segments of frontier society. Drivers routinely translated between English, Spanish, various Native American languages, and immigrant dialects, facilitating communication that would otherwise have been impossible. They understood the social customs of diverse communities and could help passengers navigate unfamiliar cultural territories. One passenger journal from 1882 noted, "Our driver instructed us on proper greeting rituals before reaching the Paiute settlement, likely preventing serious offense through our ignorance." The most surprising aspect of stagecoach drivers' lives might be their role in frontier diplomacy. Regularly traversing territories claimed by hostile or semi-hostile Native American tribes, drivers often developed relationships that allowed safe passage through otherwise dangerous regions. These informal diplomatic channels sometimes proved more effective than official government negotiations. An 1875 Army report reluctantly acknowledged, "The stage driver, Hollister, has secured through personal relationships what 3 treaty commissions have failed to achieve: reliable, safe passage through Comanche hunting grounds." These diplomatic skills rarely appear in fictional portrayals that prefer to emphasize conflict over cooperation. As the driver checks his pocket watch and prepares for departure, you consider the economic influence these men wielded. Drivers often served as informal investment advisors, having unique visibility into developing opportunities across wide territories. They observed which settlements were thriving, where new resources had been discovered, and which enterprises showed promise. Numerous mining rushes, land development projects, and business ventures began with tips from observant drivers who noticed promising activity along their routes. One Montana silver boom reportedly began after a driver mentioned to a passenger that he'd seen men hauling peculiar grey rock from a hillside previously considered worthless. The communication network drivers created had significant political implications as well. In an era when news traveled slowly, drivers served as political couriers, carrying not just official communications but rumors, warnings, and strategic information between power centers. They understood territorial politics with remarkable sophistication, often predicting developments before they became public. An 1881 letter from a territorial governor complained, "The stage driver knew of my replacement a full week before I received official notification from Washington." This political intelligence made drivers valuable confidants for frontier leaders who needed information. Advantages in rapidly changing circumstances. With a crack of the whip, the stagecoach lurches forward, beginning its journey. The most poignant aspect of stagecoach drivers' lives was perhaps their uniquely intimate connection to the transformation of the West. These men literally witnessed the frontier change under their wheels, forests becoming towns, trails becoming roads, trading posts growing into cities. A particularly reflective driver named James Birch wrote in his 1883 journal, "I have carried the first mail into 17 communities that did not exist when I began driving. I delivered letters to empty land that now holds courthouses. No man has seen America changing more directly than those of us who drive the stages." This perspective made them not just witnesses to history, but active participants in its creation. As the stagecoach disappears in a cloud of dust, you're left contemplating these remarkable figures who connected the expanding nation physically and informationally. Far from the simple teamsters of popular imagination, stagecoach drivers were sophisticated information workers who created communication networks that helped transform isolated settlements into a cohesive society. They were geographers, diplomats, security specialists, news sources, cultural translators, and community connectors, roles far more complex and consequential than merely handling the reins of 6 horses. In a very real sense, They were the human infrastructure that allowed the frontier to function before formal systems could take root. With the stagecoach gone, you decide to follow rumors of a recent strike and head toward the mining camp that sprung up just outside town. As you approach, the landscape transforms, timber stripped bare from nearby hillsides, canvas tents and rough cabins clustered haphazardly, and the constant rhythm of picks striking stone punctuated by occasional shouts. This chaotic scene represents one of the most distinctive environments of the frontier, the mining camp, complete with its unique social dynamics and remarkably creative entertainments that developed in these isolated, male-dominated communities. You pick your way through the muddy pathways between dwellings, noting the strange juxtaposition of primitive conditions and occasional surprising luxuries. A man in filthy work clothes sits on an overturned bucket, playing a fine violin. Another has constructed an elaborate whirligig, powered by the nearby stream, serving no purpose beyond visual amusement. These seemingly contradictory elements reflect the reality of mining camp culture, places of grinding labor and remarkable ingenuity, where men created entertainment from whatever materials and talents were available. The first misconception about mining camps is that they were entirely focused on the desperate pursuit of wealth. While the search for valuable minerals certainly drove their formation, daily life quickly developed complex social structures and diversions that went far beyond mere resource extraction. An 1876 letter from a Colorado silver camp noted, "Though every man came to find his fortune, we spend our evenings in pursuits that would surprise those who imagine us as mere money seekers." Last night featured a debate on classical literature that would have honored a college hall. This intellectual life rarely appears in fictional portrayals that emphasize only the rougher aspects of camp culture. You pass a crude structure with a sign announcing library and reading room, membership $50 monthly. Inside, miners crowd around shared newspapers and dog-eared books. Surprisingly, literacy rates in mining camps typically exceeded national averages, and the demand for reading material was nearly insatiable. Camp libraries, often just a shelf in a tent at first, became important community institutions. Records from one Nevada mining camp show its library grew from 8 donated books to over 200 volumes in just 6 months, all purchased through subscriber fees. The most popular readings: Shakespeare, Victor Hugo, and scientific journals, hardly the exclusive diet of dime novels and sensationalist newspapers portrayed in Western fiction. Historians still debate whether mining camp intellectual life represented genuine cultural sophistication or merely a response to extreme boredom. Some scholars argue these educational pursuits reflected the surprisingly diverse backgrounds of miners, many of whom had formal education or professional training before seeking frontier fortunes. Others suggest that the harsh realities of isolation and monotonous labor simply drove men to create mental stimulation through whatever means available. An 1879 diary from a California miner notes, "Have begun teaching Lopez mathematics in exchange for Spanish lessons. Neither subject has practical application here, but it preserves our minds from turning to stone like the mountains we pick at daily." As evening approaches, you notice men gathering for what appears to be the camp's main entertainment event, a storytelling competition held around a massive bonfire. This performance tradition, known variously as windying, spinning, or tall talking, represented one of the most distinctive art forms of the mining frontier. Competitions rewarded the most creative, elaborate fabrications presented with a straight face, essentially elevating creative lying to performance art. These contests followed surprisingly formal rules, with judges awarding points for originality, descriptive language, and the ability to maintain internal logic, no matter how preposterous the premise. You find a spot at the edge of the gathering, listening as a weathered miner describes discovering a valley where gold nuggets grow like fruit on trees, defended by birds with metallic feathers and beaks that can crack stone. The tale continues with elaborate details about harvesting techniques and the specific tools required. This tradition of competitive fabrication had practical value beyond entertainment. It built community bonds, established reputational hierarchies based on wit rather than wealth or strength, and provided psychological escape from the harsh realities of mining life. One mining camp psychologist, yes, a few camps actually had them observed in 1882. The men who excel at spinning maintain better spirits during the inevitable disappointments of prospecting. Their imaginative facility seems to provide emotional resilience. The mining camp's most physically active entertainment comes into view as two men prepare for a rooster fight, not involving actual birds, but grown men who, with hands bound behind their backs and hopping on one foot, attempt to shoulder each other off balance. The crowd roars with each near fall. These improvised competitive games ranged from adaptations of childhood pastimes to entirely novel creations specific to mining environments. Mucking contests timed how quickly competitors could fill ore carts. Rock drilling competitions showcased the fundamental skills of the mining trade. Even mundane tasks like bean sorting or tool maintenance were transformed into spectator sports through competitive frameworks. What's particularly notable about these games was their role in diffusing potential violence in high-stress environments. Physical competitions provided controlled outlets for aggression and established merit hierarchies that didn't require actual fighting. One mining camp superintendent wrote in his 1880 reports, "Since instituting the Saturday contests, knife incidents have decreased by 2/3, while productivity has improved. Men channel their frustrations into winning at drilling rather than settling scores through violence." This sophisticated use of structured competition as social regulation rarely appears in simplified frontier narratives. Music emerges from several quarters of the camp now, a harmonica from one tent, a banjo from another, and someone picking out a tune on a piano that must have been transported to this remote location at extraordinary expense. Musical culture in mining camps was remarkably diverse and often surprisingly sophisticated. Census records from western mining regions show musicians were disproportionately represented compared to the general population, with many professional or semi-professional players seeking mining fortunes while maintaining their artistic identities. The result was often an incongruous level of musical quality in primitive settings. One astonished visitor to a Montana camp wrote in 1877, "I heard Schubert performed by a string quartet in a structure with a dirt floor and canvas walls. The musicians played from memory, their instruments the only possessions they saved when rushing to the diggings. You notice a small group gathered around a man reading aloud from handwritten pages, the camp newspaper, produced without a printing press. These written newspapers, copied by hand and passed between mining camps, represented remarkable feats of dedication to information sharing, typically produced by one or two literate individuals with journalistic aspirations. They combined local news, mining information, creative writing, and humor. The Bonanza Bugle, produced in a Nevada silver camp, circulated 17 handwritten copies weekly for nearly a year before acquiring a proper press. Each edition required approximately 30 hours of copying labor, a significant investment in a community where time literally equated to potential gold or silver extraction. The most elaborate entertainments in established mining camps were theatrical productions that ranged from simple staged readings to surprisingly ambitious full performances. You observe preparations for what appears to be a Shakespeare adaptation, with miners constructing rough sets and rehearsing lines after their day's labor. These productions often featured all-male casts out of necessity, creating the frontier version of Elizabethan theatre traditions. Contemporary accounts describe miners playing female roles with remarkable commitment, developing specialized performance techniques that became distinctive theatrical traditions. An 1882 review in a Colorado newspaper praised a production of Romeo and Juliet where Mr. O'Donnell's Juliet combined emotional delicacy with a frontier authenticity that, while clearly a man in a dress, achieved moments of genuine poignancy. As night fully envelops the camp, another unique entertainment emerges: the improvised shadow puppet show, created by casting lantern light on a stretched canvas. This art form, requiring minimal materials but considerable creativity, became a distinctive mining camp tradition. Performers created elaborate stories through hand shadows and simple cutout figures, often developing ongoing episodic narratives that continued for months. The Shadow Saga of Big Jim, documented in several California mining camps, ran for over 2 years with weekly installments following the adventures of a fictional prospector represented entirely through shadows. This ingenious adaptation to limited resources produced an art form specifically suited to mining environments. Perhaps the most poignant mining camp entertainment was the creation of elaborate fantasy worlds through collaborative storytelling. Groups of miners would collectively develop fictional communities, complete with geography, residents, businesses, and ongoing narratives. These imaginary settlements, often representing idealized versions of the world they'd left behind or hoped to create with mining wealth, became shared mental landscapes maintained through regular updates and discussions. One particularly well-documented example, Prosperity, existed as a consensual fiction among a group of Colorado miners for over 3 years, with participants visiting different businesses and discussing developments as though reporting from an actual place. This collaborative, imaginative exercise created psychological sustenance in physically demanding circumstances. As you prepare to depart the mining camp, a final observation strikes you. The remarkable creativity displayed in these entertainments reveals an often overlooked aspect of frontier psychology. These weren't just rough men desperately seeking wealth, but complex individuals creating meaning, community, and art in challenging circumstances. Their ingenious adaptations, transforming limited resources into rich entertainment. Traditions demonstrate the fundamentally human drive to create culture, even in the most utilitarian environments. The next time you imagine the Old West's mining camps, remember not just the gold seekers with picks and pans, but also the storytellers, musicians, actors, and game creators who transformed these rugged worksites into functioning communities with their own distinctive cultural lives. You leave the lively mining camp behind, traveling through increasingly sparse terrain until you crest a hill and encounter an entirely different scene. A collection of weathered buildings standing silent and empty, windows gaping like hollow eye sockets in the afternoon sun. You've stumbled upon one of the most haunting features of the western landscape, a ghost town. These abandoned settlements offer a fascinating window into the boom and bust economic life cycle that most history books gloss over, but that shaped the development of the entire frontier. You pick your way carefully along what was once the main street, boards creaking beneath your feet on a sidewalk that still stands in places. A faded sign swings on rusted hinges, announcing Prosperity Hotel with cruel irony. Ghost towns weren't simply abandoned on a whim. They represent the endpoint of complex economic processes that created, sustained, and ultimately doomed hundreds of frontier communities in patterns that economic historians are still studying today. The first misconception about ghost towns is that they were primarily mining settlements. While mining camps certainly produced many spectacular boom and bust cycles, abandoned towns resulted from numerous economic specializations. Timber towns died when forests were depleted. Railroad construction camps became obsolete once tracks were completed. Even agricultural communities could be abandoned when water sources failed or soil fertility collapsed. What united these various ghost towns wasn't their economic base, but the fundamental pattern of resource exploitation followed by depletion or obsolescence, a cycle that defined much of Western development. You peer through the window of what was once a general store, seeing shelves still stocked with a few dusty cans and bottles, as if the proprietor stepped out momentarily rather than decades ago. This common ghost town feature reflects the sudden nature of many abandonments. When economic collapse hit frontier settlements, departure often occurred in waves of escalating urgency. An 1883 account from a Nevada mining town describes the process. First left the professionals, lawyers and doctors sensing opportunities end. Next, the merchants, selling inventory at loss before departing. Finally, even the optimists accepted defeat, often leaving possessions too costly to transport. This evacuation pattern appears consistently across different types of ghost towns. Historians still debate whether frontier boom towns were economic aberrations or represented a rational resource extraction model. Some scholars argue these communities were fundamentally speculative bubbles, driven by irrational exuberance and inadequate information. Others contend they functioned exactly as designed, temporary resource extraction mechanisms never intended for sustainability. Evidence exists for both interpretations. Town planning documents from some mining settlements show infrastructure investments only justifiable with decades of productivity, suggesting genuine belief in longevity. Meanwhile, other towns were literally designed to be disassembled, with buildings constructed in sections that could be bolted together or taken apart for transport to the next opportunity. You pass what was clearly once a bank, a solid stone structure among mostly wooden buildings, its vault door still visible through the broken front window. The economic story of ghost towns is written in their architecture, with building materials and design reflecting both economic optimism and practical contingency planning. Substantial brick or stone structures typically appeared only after a settlement demonstrated at least 2 years of prosperity, serving as community bets on long-term viability. The presence of such permanent structures in ghost towns reveals communities that believed in their futures right until their economic foundations collapsed. The most heartbreaking examples include towns abandoned just as major infrastructure was completed, opera houses that never hosted performances, schools that never taught students. What's particularly fascinating about ghost towns is how predictable their life cycle often was. Economic historians have identified consistent patterns in frontier, boom-bust communities that followed almost formulaic progressions. The typical mining town, for instance, moved through distinct phases. The initial rush, characterized by tents and minimal infrastructure. The establishment period, first permanent buildings and basic services. The maturity phase, development of cultural institutions and non-essential businesses. And finally, either stability through economic diversification or collapse and abandonment. This progression was so reliable that some frontier entrepreneurs specialized in following these cycles, investing at specific stages and selling before anticipated downturns. You enter what was once a saloon, its long bar still standing, though the mirror behind it is long gone. Bottles litter the floor where shelves collapsed. The saloon's central position in this ghost town reflects another economic reality, the specific businesses that marked each phase of a frontier town's development. Saloons and general stores came first, representing essential services. Professional offices, doctors, lawyers, assiers, marked the second phase. Specialized retail establishments indicated growing sophistication. Finally, cultural institutions like theaters, libraries, and social club buildings represented peak development. By reading the commercial buildings in a ghost town, economic historians can determine precisely how far along the development curve a settlement progressed before its collapse. The most revealing ghost town structures weren't business establishments, but rather residential buildings, which you now examine as you move into what was once a neighborhood of small homes. Housing types reflected both economic confidence and social stratification. Initial boom phases featured primarily canvas structures and rough cabins intended for single male workers. The appearance of proper family homes with multiple rooms marked a crucial transition point when communities began seeing themselves as permanent. The most economically mature frontier towns developed distinct neighborhoods with clear property value hierarchies. A development phase, this particular ghost town clearly reached, judging by the varying sizes and quality of homes still standing. What's not immediately visible, but profoundly important to understanding. Ghost towns are the boom-time property values they once commanded. At their economic peaks, many frontier boom towns had real estate prices rivaling or exceeding major eastern cities. An 1876 commercial lot in the center of Virginia City, Nevada reportedly sold for more per square foot than comparable properties in San Francisco. These inflated values created economic distortions throughout boom communities, with cascading effects when the inevitable collapse occurred. One economic historian described these real estate bubbles as wealth hallucinations, that drove both irrational investment and excessive leverage through frontier banking systems. Speaking of banking, you notice another substantial building that likely served as a secondary financial institution, suggesting this town reached significant economic sophistication before its abandonment. The banking systems in boomtowns represented particularly interesting economic case studies, operating with minimal regulation and often engaging in practices that would be considered predatory or fraudulent by modern standards. Some frontier banks issued their own currency backed by anticipated mineral extraction, essentially creating local monetary systems based on geological optimism rather than existing reserves. When extraction failed to meet projections, these currencies collapsed, wiping out local savings and accelerating community abandonment. Historians still debate the broader economic impact of these boom-bust cycles on Western development. Some argue that despite their spectacular failures, boom towns collectively drove infrastructure development that outlasted individual communities. Railroads built to serve mines continued operating long after the original economic justification disappeared. Telegraph lines connecting boomtowns remained, creating communication networks that supported subsequent development. Others emphasize the tremendous waste of capital and human resources these cycles represented, suggesting more gradual, sustainable development models might have produced greater long-term benefits. Both perspectives contain elements of truth, reflecting the complex legacy of frontier economic patterns. As the sun begins to set, casting long shadows through the empty buildings, you consider perhaps the most poignant aspect of ghost towns, their role as economic time capsules. Unlike communities that evolved gradually, these abandoned settlements froze at specific historical moments when economic viability suddenly ended. This preservation makes them invaluable to economic historians studying frontier commercial patterns, consumption habits, technological adoption, and daily life. The artifacts remaining in ghost towns, from household items to business equipment, provide unusually clear snapshots of economic life at precise moments in frontier development. The most fascinating question ghost towns raise isn't why they died, but why some similar settlements survived when the same economic challenges struck. For every ghost town, there's often a nearby community that faced identical resource depletion or market shifts, yet managed to adapt and continue. These survival stories typically involved economic diversification before crisis struck. Communities that recognized their vulnerable economic position and actively developed alternative industries demonstrated remarkable resilience. One Colorado mining town avoided abandonment by transitioning to cattle production years before silver prices collapsed, while its single-resource neighbor became a ghost town within months of the same market shift. As darkness falls, making further exploration unsafe, you prepare to depart this silent monument to boom and bust economics. The ghost town stands as a three-dimensional textbook of frontier development patterns, revealing through its empty buildings and abandoned artifacts the complex interplay of speculation, resource extraction, community formation, and economic collapse that characterized so much of Western expansion. These weren't simply failed settlements, but rather completed life cycle communities that served their economic purpose and then expired, leaving behind physical reminders of the transitory nature of economies built on non-renewable resource extraction or temporary advantages. In their silent testimony, ghost towns offer lessons about sustainability and economic diversification that remain relevant in regions still experiencing similar boom-bust cycles today. The next morning, you continue your journey across the frontier, following a stream that winds through a narrow valley. Rounding a bend, you encounter an encampment unlike any you've seen before. A small group of tipis set in a semicircle near the water. Several Native American men sit outside, watching your approach with measured interest rather than hostility. This unexpected meeting offers an opportunity to explore one of the most fundamentally misunderstood aspects of Western history: the complex, nuanced interactions between native peoples and settlers that went far beyond the simplified warfare narrative dominating popular culture. You raise your hand in greeting, and after a moment, one of the men returns the gesture. This basic exchange represents thousands of similar moments that occurred across the frontier, initial contacts that could develop in countless directions depending on specific circumstances, individual personalities, and regional histories. The reality of Native American settler relations was neither the relentless conflict portrayed in early westerns nor the harmonious cultural exchange suggested by more recent revisionist accounts. The truth existed in a complex middle ground where trade, diplomacy, cultural exchange, and yes, conflict, all occurred simultaneously in intricate patterns. As you're motioned to approach, you notice something surprising about the encampment. Several items of obviously European or American manufacture are visible: metal cooking pots, wool blankets, and what appears to be a disassembled rifle that one man is carefully cleaning. This material hybridization was typical long before direct contact became common in many regions. Trade networks operated across vast distances, meaning European goods often arrived in native communities decades before actual Europeans did. By the time direct contact occurred, many native groups had already incorporated foreign tools, weapons, and materials into their cultures in selective, strategic ways that served their own purposes. The first misconception to address about native settler interactions is the notion that Native Americans were passive recipients of European influence rather than active agents making calculated decisions. Historical records clearly show native leaders skillfully playing competing European powers against each other, forming strategic alliances, adopting useful technologies while rejecting others, and generally pursuing their own political and economic interests with sophisticated understanding of the changing power dynamics. An 1863 letter from a frustrated U.S. Army colonel complained, "The Lakota understand our conflict with the Confederacy better than many of our own citizens and leverage this knowledge in every negotiation. Extracting concessions they know we cannot refuse given our divided attention. You're invited to sit, and one of the men offers you coffee." Another indicator of the cultural exchange that characterized frontier interactions. Historians still debate the extent and nature of this exchange, with some arguing it primarily represented pragmatic adaptation rather than genuine cultural blending. Others point to evidence of deeper cross-cultural influences, including spiritual practices, artistic traditions, and social customs that moved in both directions. What's clear from contemporary accounts is that the frontier witnessed the creation of unique hybrid cultures that weren't simply native or European, but something new emerging from sustained interaction. These cultural borderlands produced innovations ranging from distinct architectural styles, to new musical forms, to syncretic religious practices that borrowed elements from multiple traditions. Trade formed the foundation of many native settler relationships, creating economic interdependencies that often promoted peaceful coexistence despite cultural differences. You notice one man working with glass beads, incorporating them into a traditional design, a perfect visual representation of how trade goods were absorbed into native artistic traditions. By the 1870s, complex commercial networks connected native communities to global markets, with some groups becoming essential suppliers of specific commodities. The Nez Perce bred and sold highly prized horses. Certain Apache bands controlled trade routes through territories too difficult for the U.S. military to access. Ojibwe communities supplied valuable birch bark to manufacturers. These economic relationships created shared interests that sometimes transcended cultural tensions. The coffee you're offered is boiled in a traditional manner, but served in a tin cup. Obtained through trade, another small example of the practical hybridization that characterized daily life. One of the most significant yet overlooked aspects of native settler relations was the transfer of environmental knowledge that helped newcomers survive in unfamiliar landscapes. Native guides shared vital information about water sources, weather patterns, plant properties, and terrain features that European geographic knowledge systems couldn't provide. An 1858 surveyor's report candidly acknowledged, "Without our Paiute guides, we would have perished within a week of leaving the last outpost." Their understanding of this seemingly barren landscape revealed resources invisible to our perception, but essential to our survival. Communication across cultural and linguistic boundaries created another layer of complexity in native settler relations. You notice that the man who seems to be the leader speaks to you in a mixture of his native language, English words, and hand signs, reflecting the development of frontier pidgin languages and sign systems that facilitated interaction. By the 1880s, complex communication networks existed that allowed information to travel between disparate cultural groups, often translated multiple times before reaching its final recipient. These communication channels carried not just practical information, but cultural concepts, stories, and perspectives that influenced both native and settler worldviews in subtle but significant ways. Historians still debate whether the frontier represented primarily a military conquest or a more complex process of negotiation and adaptation. Evidence exists for both interpretations, often within the same regions and time periods. Military conflicts certainly occurred and had devastating consequences for native communities. However, documents from the same era show numerous instances of negotiated arrangements, mutual accommodations, and even formal alliances that don't fit neatly into a simple conquest narrative. An 1872 treaty negotiation transcript reveals Comanche leaders strategically accepting certain territorial concessions to secure hunting rights they considered more valuable, while simultaneously negotiating educational access for their children. Hardly the actions of a people simply being conquered. You observe a woman in the camp teaching a child to identify plants along the stream bank, pointing out specific characteristics and demonstrating proper harvesting techniques. This scene highlights another often overlooked reality: native knowledge systems continued evolving and being transmitted to new generations throughout the frontier period, rather than representing static, traditional cultures overwhelmed by progressive European technology. Native communities actively incorporated new elements into dynamic, adaptive knowledge systems. Anthropological field notes from the 1880s document Lakota healers experimenting with combining European medicines with traditional remedies, systematically testing and refining hybrid approaches based on observed results, a process mirroring scientific method within a different cultural framework. The diplomatic dimension of native settler relations was particularly sophisticated, yet remains underappreciated in popular understandings of frontier history. As you converse with the group's leader through limited shared language and gestures, you're participating in the kind of preliminary diplomatic contact that occurred thousands of times across the West. By the mid-19th century, many native groups had developed specialized diplomatic protocols for engaging with different European powers, American officials, and other native nations. These diplomatic systems included formal procedures for establishing relationships, exchanging gifts, making agreements, and resolving conflicts. Complex political technologies developed specifically to manage intercultural relations in contested territories. What's particularly striking about native diplomacy was its emphasis on personal relationships, rather than abstract political entities, where European and American systems increasingly relied on impersonal institutions and written documents. Native diplomatic traditions focused on establishing specific relationships between individuals who personally embodied their community's interests. This fundamental difference in diplomatic approach created frequent misunderstandings, but also opened possibilities for flexible arrangements that official government policies might have precluded. Many frontier regions operated under informal agreements between local settlers and native leaders that contradicted official policies, but better served immediate practical needs for coexistence. As your visit concludes, and you prepare to continue your journey, one of the men presents you with a small carved stone animal, a traditional gesture of diplomatic goodwill that creates a symbolic connection between visitor and host. This exchange represents countless similar interactions that established webs of relationship across cultural boundaries. The frontier wasn't simply a line of conflict advancing westward, as older histories suggested. Nor was it a romanticized space of harmonious cultural blending. Rather, it was a complex zone of interaction where diverse peoples negotiated new relationships and adaptations through processes that included conflict but also cooperation, cultural exchange, trade, diplomacy, and the gradual emergence of hybrid practices and identities. The most important insight about native settler relations might be recognizing that neither Native Americans nor settlers represented monolithic groups. The West contained dozens of distinct native nations with different languages, cultural practices, political structures, and strategic interests. Similarly, settlers included ethnically diverse populations with varying objectives and attitudes toward native peoples. This tremendous diversity produced equally diverse forms of interaction, ranging from sustained violent conflict to peaceful coexistence to intermarriage and cultural blending, sometimes all occurring simultaneously in different parts of the same region. Understanding this complexity is essential to moving beyond the simplified narratives that have dominated popular understanding of Western history. As you continue your journey with the carved stone tucked safely in your pocket, you carry a small reminder of the countless exchanges material, cultural, and diplomatic that shaped the frontier in ways far more nuanced than most historical accounts acknowledge. Beyond the dramatic conflicts that dominate Western films lie these quieter but equally significant interactions through which diverse peoples navigated a rapidly changing world, creating in the process new cultural forms and social arrangements that would ultimately define the emerging American West. Your journey across the frontier is nearing its end as you crest a hill and see something unexpected in the valley below. A small town with neatly painted houses, streets arranged in a grid pattern, and a water tower rising above the church steeple. Unlike the haphazard frontier settlements you've encountered so far, this community displays unmistakable signs of permanence and Eastern influence. You've arrived at a pivotal historical moment, the closing of the American frontier, that transitional period when the Wild West gradually transformed into settled communities integrated into the broader American society. You make your way down toward the town, noticing three specific elements that historians identify as the primary forces that tamed the frontier: a barbed wire fence enclosing previously open rangeland, a photographer's studio with a prominent sign, and a general store displaying the latest Sears, Roebuck & Co. catalog. These seemingly ordinary features represent the revolutionary technologies, documentation practices, and economic systems that collectively ended the frontier era far more effectively than any military campaign or government policy. Let's explore how photography, barbed wire, and mail-order catalogs, along with other overlooked innovations, transformed the West from frontier to settled territory. As you approach the town, your attention is drawn to the fence lines stretching across the landscape. Few innovations changed the West more fundamentally than barbed wire. Patented by Joseph Glidden in 1874, this simple technology, steel wire, twisted with small metal barbs, resolved the central conflict that had defined the frontier, the tension between open-range ranching and settled agriculture. Prior to barbed wire, constructing fences on the largely treeless plains was prohibitively expensive, forcing an uneasy and often violent coexistence between cattlemen who needed open range and farmers who needed protected fields. Barbed wire made affordable fencing possible, effectively privatizing what had been a commons and transforming the economic foundation of frontier society. The impact of barbed wire went far beyond mere convenience. It fundamentally altered the human geography of the West, the distribution of economic power, and even the ecological systems of the plains. An 1883 Texas newspaper editorial lamented, "This devil's rope is transforming our state from one where any man's cow could roam freely to a patchwork of private holdings as restrictive as any eastern state." Within a single decade, millions of acres of previously open range were enclosed, ending the era of long cattle drives, restricting the movement of wildlife, and solidifying property rights in ways that favored agricultural settlement over nomadic or semi-nomadic lifeways. Perhaps no other single technology so quickly and completely transformed such a vast landscape. You continue toward the town center, passing the photographer's studio where a family dressed in their Sunday best poses stiffly for a portrait. Photography played a surprisingly powerful role in closing the frontier, though its influence was more subtle than barbed wire's physical impact. As camera technology became more portable in the 1870s and 1880s, photographers documented the West extensively, transforming public perception of what had been an imagined space of unlimited possibility into a visually defined, knowable place with specific characteristics. These images circulated widely in the East, demystifying the frontier and effectively incorporating it into the national visual consciousness. Historians still debate the full impact of frontier photography. Some scholars argue these images primarily served Eastern consumption, creating a tamed version of the West that made it psychologically accessible for settlement. Others emphasize how photography accelerated actual development by providing visual evidence of resources and opportunities. What's clear is that the act of visual documentation fundamentally changed the relationship between the West and the rest of America. An 1885 railroad promotional pamphlet explicitly acknowledged this power. Our photographic surveys have removed all mystery from these lands. Potential settlers now journey not to an unknown wilderness but to landscapes already familiar through our published images. The general store comes into view now, its windows displaying a wide array of manufactured goods impossible to produce locally. On a prominent stand near the entrance sits a thick Sears, Roebuck & Co. catalog, perhaps the most transformative publication in Western history. These mail-order catalogs, which reached even the most isolated homesteads by the 1890s, connected frontier communities to the national consumer economy more effectively than railroads or telegraphs alone could accomplish. With thousands of products available through postal delivery, Western settlers could maintain material connections to American consumer culture despite geographic isolation. This commercial integration accelerated the cultural and economic standardization that effectively ended frontier distinctiveness. What made mail-order catalogs particularly revolutionary was their democratization of material culture. Prior to their widespread adoption, frontier communities relied on local merchants who typically offered limited selections at inflated prices. The 1897 Sears catalog explicitly positioned itself against this system. "We are the cheapest supply house on earth, the greatest store in the world. We save you 15 to 40% on everything you wear, eat, or use." This economic disruption undermined local monopolies while simultaneously standardizing material life across previously distinct regions. From North Dakota to New Mexico, families ordered identical furniture, tools, clothing, and household goods, creating a nationally consistent domestic environment that erased much of the frontier's material distinctiveness. As you enter the town proper, you notice a work crew stringing telephone wire between newly erected poles, yet another technology integrating this community into national networks. The communication revolution of the late 19th century, including telegraphs, telephones, and expanded postal service, collapsed the information isolation that had defined frontier experience. By 1900, news that once took weeks or months to reach remote settlements arrived in hours or days. This compression of communication time fundamentally altered the frontier's relationship to national culture, politics, and social movements. As one Montana newspaper editor observed in 1891, "The telegraph has killed our splendid isolation. We are now merely a distant neighborhood of Chicago rather than a world unto ourselves." You pass the town's school, hearing children reciting lessons in unison. Educational standardization represented another powerful force in closing the frontier. As territorial school systems adopted standardized curricula, textbooks, and teaching methods aligned with Eastern models, distinctive regional knowledge systems gradually gave way to nationally consistent education. This process was often explicitly intended to integrate frontier communities into mainstream American culture. An 1889 Wyoming school superintendent's report stated this goal directly. Our educational mission is to ensure that children born on these distant plains grow up as thoroughly American in outlook and values as any child in Massachusetts or Ohio. This educational homogenization effectively ended the cultural distinctiveness that had characterized frontier communities. Reaching the town center, you observe a political rally in progress, with a speaker enthusiastically promoting statehood. The political integration of Western territories through the statehood process formalized the closing of the frontier through governance structures. This transition from territorial status, effectively semi-colonial administration, to full state membership in the Union, represented the final stage in the frontier's absorption into the nation. But the process involved more than just political reorganization. It required Western communities to demonstrate their readiness by adopting institutions, practices, and cultural norms compatible with Eastern expectations. This conformity pressure accelerated the abandonment of frontier adaptations in favor of nationally standardized approaches to everything from legal codes to civic architecture. The final element you notice about this transitional community is something less visible but equally transformative: the shift in how people conceptualized time and space. You check your watch, a technology that itself standardized time experience, and observe townspeople hurrying to appointments or consulting train schedules. The frontier's relatively fluid relationship with time, governed more by seasons, daylight, and immediate needs than by clock time, gave way to the industrialized time discipline necessary for integration into national economic systems. Similarly, the Western experience of space as vast, open, and relatively unbounded yielded to increasingly precise survey boundaries, property lines, and jurisdictional divisions that made space knowable, controllable, and commodifiable. As evening approaches, you find yourself on the town's edge, looking back at the community lights beginning to glow in windows, while simultaneously facing the darker open country beyond. This visual juxtaposition perfectly captures the historical moment of the closing frontier, the transitional period when the West existed simultaneously as both the wild space of popular imagination and the increasingly settled, integrated region it was rapidly becoming. The frontier didn't end in a single moment, but rather through a complex process of technological, economic, and cultural integration that transformed both the physical landscape and how people related to it. What makes this historical transition particularly fascinating is how quickly it occurred. Within a single generation, roughly 1870 to 1900, the American West transformed from a region defined by its separation from national systems to one increasingly integrated into standardized American patterns. The speed of this transformation helps explain why the frontier loomed so large in American cultural memory even after its practical disappearance. The nation barely had time to adjust to the reality of a closed frontier before beginning to mythologize what had been lost. This myth-making process itself represented the final stage in the frontier's closure, the transformation of lived experience into nostalgic narrative. As darkness falls completely, you gaze at the stars above, the same stars that guided countless travelers across this landscape before modern navigation and infrastructure made such guidance less necessary. The closing of the American frontier represented more than just the settlement of geographic space. It marked a fundamental shift in the nation's relationship with possibility itself. The frontier had served as America's blank canvas, the place where alternative social arrangements could be imagined and sometimes briefly realized. Its closure required a psychological adjustment as significant as the practical adaptations that transformed the region. Perhaps this explains why even in contemporary America, the frontier continues to exert such powerful influence on national imagination. Not simply as historical memory, but as a psychological space of possibility that closed perhaps too quickly for the national consciousness to fully process its disappearance. Sleep comes easily tonight as you drift off, thinking about the remarkable journey through the Old West. The landscape of this bygone era, with its stagecoaches and six-shooters, mining camps and ghost towns, slowly fades into your dreams. These weren't just colorful settings for adventure stories, but real places where people lived complex lives, creating communities and cultures adapted to challenging circumstances. What makes the Old West so enduringly fascinating isn't just its dramatic elements, but the ingenuity people displayed in responding to unprecedented situations. From the sophisticated lantern communication systems of the railroads, to the practical hygiene solutions of trail-bound cowboys, from the economic innovations of frontier saloons, to the complex diplomatic practices that characterized native settler relations, the West was a laboratory of human adaptation and creativity. As your consciousness drifts toward sleep, remember that while you wouldn't likely survive long in the actual frontier without your modern skills and expectations, the spirit of innovation and resilience that defined that era remains accessible to us all. Perhaps that's the true legacy of the American West, not its mythology of rugged individualism, but its demonstration of human adaptability in the face of challenge. Rest well, knowing that tonight's journey through the Old West is complete, but the fascinating stories of this pivotal era in American history await whenever you're ready to explore them again.